All right, the button pressing has commenced. Here we are. This is Jay Brown Yoga Talks podcast. My name is Jay Brown. If this happens to be your first time listening today, let me welcome you. Everyone else, what's up? I hope this moment is finding you reasonably well, that you are residing with some certainty in your spiritual nature and not feeling thrown by the turbulences of the material world. I am recording this on Mother's Day, and I have just completed the first half of my duties, which involved making a Mother's Day brunch. And I must say, I killed it. Cinnamon swirl challah bread French toast, roasted potatoes, some eggs. And not only that, I baked the cinnamon swirl challah bread myself yesterday. Come on! The biggest thing for me was getting everything to time out, right? I always screw that up. This thing's done too early and then this thing is not warm, like keeping stuff warm and having everything come out at the same time. That seems to me the biggest challenge with complex celebratory meals that are all on me to complete. But I think today I nailed it. So that feels good. It's nice to see my wife feeling respected and loved. I don't know why we do it on today, Mother's Day. It's like some kind of a Hallmark marketing thing, but it doesn't matter. It was lovely to make something that I felt good about and to see the family enjoy it. I do have a dinner to do this evening, but I'm well prepared for that as well. I hope any mothers out there, that you're feeling honored and loved. I do have a quick update on the yoga center for those of you who have been around and listening. I was in touch with the landlord again this week, and I haven't signed an actual lease, but he confirmed that it was a go. I basically have 2 months to get my ducks in a row, so to speak. And let's just say the ducks are definitely not in a row right now. I have so many decisions that I need to make. Small ones and big ones. Small ones like, what am I going to call the place? How do I want to charge for classes? How do I want to run it if I'm inviting other teachers in? How do I want to work it? Regular listeners know I've been discussing lots of different models for how to run yoga centers for years, and now it's time for me to walk my talk and make some decisions that I think will make sense. Probably the biggest challenge right now is financial. I don't have seed money right now. I don't have that chunk of money that I need to get through the first 6 to 8 months. Anybody who's opened a yoga center knows what I'm talking about, or any business for that matter. It's like the first year, you gotta have a little bit of something to ride on to get it going. And I don't have that. And that freaks me out, because last time I did, I got an SBA loan, and that's how I managed to have this like seed money to open a center. But I'm so in debt right now. I can't get another SBA loan right now. So I don't know what I'm going to do. I'm a little scared about that, but everything in my heart is telling me that it's the right thing to do. And I would say more than anything is having some purpose behind it. Like there needs to be a really good reason for me to do this right now, because it's certainly not money. Even if it goes great, I'm not going to make enough money to completely support myself and my family. It would be enough of a chunk to balance out with the online stuff and other things that I think it would be good. And really, it's about doing something in my neighborhood and getting back to something that feels like it's gotten away from me when it comes to being a teacher and being in relationship with other people and all kinds of things. So there really is an important reason, I think, to do it now. And that is what I'm staying focused on, because that is what gives me like a feeling of being motivated to take on what feels like an overwhelming challenge. So lots coming on that front, and I'll keep you posted. Speaking of deeper purpose and understanding what you're doing as a yoga teacher and why, my guest today is Godfrey Devereux. And Godfrey has been on the show before some years back. We discussed his previous visit. But just to say, one of the first books I ever read was of Godfrey, and it's just wonderful for me all these years later to connect with him in such a deep way. You're really in store for what I consider to be a nuanced conversation about yoga and why to practice it and why to teach it. Very grateful to have had this opportunity to speak with Godfrey again, and it's my pleasure to be sharing it with you today. Real quick before we get to it, let me mention that we do have an ongoing promotion just for the month of May for email subscribers only. It's a very big promotion, 70% off all of the on-demand video stuff, the practice videos, the online workshop, and the module continuing education course. If you're not on the email list, I encourage you to get on that email list so you can get the code for that. Also, I've got ongoing stuff. If you're looking for some practice, or you're looking to get in on some discussions, or you're just looking for some education, there's lots of ways for us to connect. If you're enjoying what you're getting from the show and you want to have access to the full-length archives and become a supporter and help us keep this boat afloat, you can become a podcast premium subscriber. All the stuff, getting on the email list, podcast premium, everything can be found at jbrownyoga.com. Okay, y'all. I think that we will just leave it there for now. I will touch base with you on the other side, but let's go ahead and get into this. Let's listen to this conversation that I had with Godfrey Devereux. Hello?
Hello, Jay.
Hi, Godfrey.
How is my sound quality?
Sounds just fine. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, perfect.
Beautiful. Good to speak with you again.
Yeah, it's been a long time.
It has been a moment. Just to mention, I'm already recording, so let's just consider ourselves having begun, okay?
Sure thing.
Cool. Well, I was just looking back at when it was that we last spoke, and it was October 2019.
Long time.
Yeah. 5 years, I wouldn't always necessarily consider that long of a time, but it sure feels like a whole other lifetime and world ago.
Yes, it does.
The other thing I was reflecting on is last time you were here, I discussed this, and just in case someone listening to this hasn't heard that conversation, I encourage them to go back and listen to it. I mentioned this then, but I was struck by it again, that it does feel very significant for me to speak with you, because I think I told you this before, that one of the very first books on yoga I ever read was written by you, called The Elements of Yoga. I believe I picked it up in 1995 or 96, shortly after it was published in 1994, if I'm not mistaken.
Something like that, yes.
And I was really struck by, because I have it sitting here, and then I was looking at the annotated yoga sutras that you also sent me.
Yes.
And I was looking at the difference between those two offerings of you, and the difference between what you put out in 1994 and what you sent me in 2024. And, it was what What I thought was most interesting about it is because in 1994 there was, and I just had a series of episodes kind of going through this from people's firsthand experiences at the time of, yoga being brought into the mainstream.
Yes.
So the elements of yoga was a really probably like the most accessible you could be about yoga in a way, It seemed like you were trying to invite everybody in,
Yes, that was definitely the point. Yeah.
And your annotated sutras that you sent me seem to me to be more specific to those who are really more serious about inquiring into yoga.
Yes, I mean, I wouldn't limit it to yoga. I would say unless you see yoga as being meditation and meditation being an expression of yoga, I think it's really about what you can experience if you give yourself deeply to the process and practice of meditation.
Yes, I wrote down something that you wrote where you referred to the sutras as a broad, deep, and multidimensional way of considering human experience.
Yes, I think it is, but I think it's let's say a consideration that takes place from a very, very deep intimacy with human intelligence, especially with the nature of perception itself.
Very interesting. I think that's true. I guess what I was thinking of is that I've come to feel that in some ways, yoga, and I guess that would be exemplified in the sutras, although there are definitely people who would debate this. I feel like there's a neutrality to it in a sense, because over the last few years, I've been having all these conversations about Ishvara, and we could talk about that some today because you do have your own thoughts on Ishvara and your annotated sutras, but on how there really is this broad spectrum of like theistic views to atheistic views that all seem to live under this very broad umbrella of yoga.
Yes, and I think, there can be no exception to that. We're all, in a sense, projecting our own understanding based on our own experience, but we have no option really but to do that unless we are functioning in a pure academic sense of analyzing or trying to analyze historical streams of thought, which, of course, is not the case with me. I'm a practitioner.
Well, I think because I've had academic voices here on the show to talk about the sutras as well as pure practitioner, intuitive voices on the sutras, I guess the debate that's always been had has to do with if there is a sort of built-in or baked-in philosophical viewpoint of the sutras or not, because I've seen people teach sutras in a way that seems to have more tantra in it, as opposed to like a more classical Raja yoga, and even you reference non-duality and duality, and these are conversations we've had on this show. So I guess my question to you is, in your taking the time, which is a massive undertaking, to write your, would you call it translation and interpretation of the sutras? I guess that's my first question. How do you think of what you've written? Do you think of it as a translation or interpretation?
Well, I would have to call it a rendering, which means I'm kind of shying away from saying translation simply because I'm not a Sanskrit scholar. Whatever Sanskrit I've picked up from reading the Yoga Sutras especially, and let's say exploring different people's translations within which one Sanskrit word can, by different interpreters stroke translators, be given even almost opposite meanings. So for me, it's a rendering. But I would just like to say that what I sent you, the Annotated Yoga Sutras, is let's say the flow of the text with notes. But I have actually other translations or other renderings. I have let's say an explanation of all of that written in everyday English, in a book called Yoga Unveiled. And then I have an even more colloquial rendering of the Yoga Sutras, which I call Yoga Decoded, which would be kind of maybe halfway between the intention or the voice of the elements of yoga and the voice of the Annotated Yoga Sutras. Because even even my rendering of the text of Patanjali that I sent to you, many people wouldn't even really be able to make head or tail of it, because it's not everyday language. It's talking about things that people have virtually no experience of themselves.
Well, that's what I meant in terms of who it seems that text might be for. Like, I knew what you were referencing. I've spent a fair amount of time considering sutras, so I knew what you were referencing and could follow along with what you've done. It's interesting that you have other renditions, as you've said. It goes to the point I was making when we started, that it seems like what you sent me is really maybe for people who have familiarity already.
Yeah, I'd say it's more hardcore.
Yes, I liked it. I was like, it's hardcore, because what's interesting to me is it seems like I've always felt very insecure about doing anything like what you did, because I'm not a Sanskrit scholar and I can't translate the Sanskrit. I've certainly talked to others like Lauren Roche who are similar, where at a certain point it seems like you've used like a comparison of other translations just along with your own observed experience to derive what you've come to. Is there particular translations that you look to more, and like how much percentage of it is compiling other translations and how much is your own observations and intuition?
Right. Well, there's a couple of questions in there. First of all, I actually did the translation a long time ago, almost 20 years ago. About 20 years ago, I did the translation, and I spent maybe 6 months doing maybe most of my free time, and I had a lot of free time. I wasn't working with it. And what I did was I had actually 4 key translations, which I put onto my computer so I could access them really, really easily. But I had about another 15 other texts. So what I was basically doing, I was taking a sutra, seeing what the general sense would be from those 4. And those 4 that I took were Fustin as a scholar, Mr. Iyengar as a yoga posture practitioner, Mukunda Styles because he has a very accessible one, and then a guy called Vyasa Houston, who is a Sanskrit teacher who teaches Sanskrit by chanting. So I took
a workshop with Vyas. I love that you raised his name on the show. Yeah. He's wonderful.
So they were my 4 kind of core reference points. But it was when I was looking further afield than them, especially into more academic people, because they're all practitioners in one sense or another, that I found conflicts. And then that kind of encouraged me to not adhere to what I was reading and to more go from my own experience. And when I kind of made that decision to give the authority to my experience, then it actually became much easier for me to do, because I found that I was actually able to make sense of the whole text. Although I must say that the second part of the 3rd chapter took me a few years more before I could.
Yeah, 3rd and 4th chapters get into a lot of interesting stuff. So sometimes you need some life under your belt, probably, for that, right?
Well, actually, I think I just needed a tip from a friend. That the 4th was no problem for me. I loved the 4th straight away, but it was all of the stuff that was kind of magical. You know, how you could develop magical powers, the Siddhis in Vibhuti Pada, and this kind of made me a little bit queasy. But then a very old friend of mine who's not interested really in yoga, except to the extent that I am, when I said something to him about it, he laughed and he said, "Godfrey, don't forget, all esoteric teachings are written in code so that outsiders can't understand them." And you know, I don't want to say that that's true of Patanjali, but in him saying that, I went back and looked at the 3rd part of the bit that I kind of rejected, and I thought, okay, if I take this as metaphors relative to the body, I can make sense of it.
I mean, I think I've always veered away from more strict teachings of Patanjali sutras because it often felt like it veered into dogmas.
Yeah.
But when it's always just been my lived experience and observations, then I can reference sutras and oh, that makes sense. That's talking about this thing or whatever. Or it can,
Exactly.
it can, seems like it can be more like points of inquiry, like jump off points for inquiry more than like it's telling me the answers.
Mm-hmm. Yes, and I think that that's the big mistake that academics make, because what else can they do? They're academics. If they're not dedicated practitioners, then they don't actually experientially know the ground about which Patanjali speaks. So then they have to, even if they don't mean to, they have to take a dogmatic position, because that's academia. You're either right or you're wrong, even if you're inquiring. And I think that one thing that we all need to admit when let's say, speaking about Patanjali, is that we are not Patanjali. We're not authorized by Patanjali. We honestly don't know what he experienced, but this is how it seems to us.
Yes. And like I said before, it does feel, because I've spoken to so many people who teach from the sutras and hold very different philosophical viewpoints, or as you said, could even have very differing views on what the sutras are saying, it does seem to have been able to be a pretty wide tent.
Yeah, I think that's part of his genius. You know, he doesn't pin himself down. As far as my take goes, he offers no practice whatsoever. So he by doing that, in a sense, he made it impossible for there to be an orthodoxy of yoga, that you have to do a certain thing, because he doesn't tell you to do anything. He just describes certain states that you can maybe experience if you what? You know, and there's the big question. And if you look for a what, I think he only gives you one what, and that's becoming intimate with your breathing.
I think that's something I've come to as well. I guess I'm curious to, you keep referencing Patanjali as an individual, and you know, there is been some debate about whether or not the commentary, what the Vyasa commentary is written by the same person or not. Folks in like the Desikachara world would say no, and I've had Chase Bossart on here talking about how he felt that there were differences if you just translate the sutras, like the shorter sutras by themselves, and you compare what the commentary is saying, that there's differences. I mean, does it matter to you? Do you think of the commentary that has often gone with it as part of the sutras, or do you take the sutras of themselves, because they really don't elaborate? They're more like content headings than like expositions on concepts, right?
Yeah, I mean, I take the position that those commentators that we're aware of, beginning with Vyasa, whose let's say, in my word, his interpretation has become associated with the text itself, and I see no reason for that at all. I think that we should say, okay, so that's his point of view, so he was a Samkhya, great, so he projects that onto that. But if we have a perspective, even if we don't have a ideology, you know, I don't think I really have an ideology that can be put in a box, but obviously I have a perspective which is based on my experience. So how can I do anything but project it? I am projecting it. But in doing that, I'm projecting it onto the Sanskrit that supposedly Patanjali wrote. And I pay no attention to the commentaries, except, of course, in the fact that they've been digested by everybody else. So there's an indirect exposure to them. But I don't consider themselves to be the Yoga Sutras.
Interesting. And I guess, do you ascribe kind of the wisdom and power of the text to the text, or to Patanjali? Like, I've heard some people talk of Patanjali as like a saint, and some people talk of him as a scribe. I remember U.G. Krishnamurti, I was in a room with him once, saying Patanjali was just an academic. He never did any of the things that he wrote about. I don't know how he would know that, but exactly. He did assert that. So I don't know, do you think of Patanjali as like a sage, a wisdom holder, or is it just he the giver of the text? How do you think of that?
I don't really think about it, because to me the text is all I know, and I'm happy to attribute it to a single individual, partly because yes, I'm not a scholar, and I'm not able to kind of do the textual analysis that suggests that different parts were made by different minds, but we all have different minds. We all have different perspectives. And as I already said to you, I have more than one translation of the text. So, and if you were to read them, they'd be completely different voices. And the one that I send you, you would probably think, oh, this guy sounds like he's a bit of an academic. And the one that I didn't send you, you think, oh, this guy sounds like more like a practitioner. But it's the same person. And so I don't have any real interest in that kind of discussion. My interest is, does this text have any value for somebody who's trying to deal with being human in a deep way? And I would say the answer absolutely is, and it's incredibly potent.
I think that's true. And I would say to you that I did not read your annotated sutras and feel like you were coming from an academic perspective. At all, because it was clear to me that it was coming from an experiential place in you more than an attempt to try to treat the text from that kind of academic place. I'll give you a perfect example. I've had people on this show years ago to debate the meaning of the word nirodha.
Yeah.
And I've heard many different translations of nirodha, whether it was cessation or stilling or directing. But I've never heard anyone say that it meant like relinquishment, like that you relinquish the mental activity. I'm curious about why you chose that word.
Well, I mean, that is kind of a very significant question relative to how I was able to feel comfortable with translating the Yoga Sutras, because my initial exposure to the Yoga Sutras was one of, let's say, I rejected it because of its claimed dualistic conceptual framework. And my experience as a meditator, which was in the Zen tradition, just wouldn't accommodate a dualistic point of view, the Zen teaching, insofar as there is any conceptualization, which there isn't much. But there is that chant that you do every day, form is emptiness, emptiness is form. And it is a deeply non-dualistic experience that I was exposed to. So my I was just reading the Yoga Sutras, obviously, as a yoga teacher. That's something that I suppose everybody does. And I rejected it. But then I went to a conference at Cambridge University, I can't remember what year, in the early 90s. And there was a Canadian guy there who was currently, at that time, I think he was a professor there. And he was giving a talk on Yoga Chitta Vritti Nirodha. And basically what he said was, look, this guy is not a dualist, and explained why. So I got incredibly excited. I couldn't really remember anything much that he said, but I got really excited by, okay, so maybe that we can look at Patanjali not through a dualistic framework. So then that's when I went back to it. And when I started to try to make sense of it, I went to a bookshop in London, which is called Watkins Bookshop, and it was started by a guy who no longer owns it, whose name I forget. And I didn't know that he was a Sanskrit scholar. And I went in there to get a dictionary, Sanskrit dictionary, and I couldn't find one. So I went to the desk where he was, and I said to him, I said, look, I'm looking for a Sanskrit dictionary and a grammar primer, if you have one. And he looked at me with this kind of strange look, and he said, why on earth would you want something like that? And I said, well, I'm a yoga teacher, and I'm trying to translate the Yoga Sutras. And he laughed. And he said, forget it. And I said, well, no, I'm not going to forget it. And then he said, well, anyway, look, I don't have them. And then he said, okay, then. And he reached under the desk, and he pulled out a briefcase, an old-style rectangular briefcase, and he flipped it open. And there were all these papers in there. And he was looking through them. He said, oh, this is my translation of the Yoga Sutras. And I kind of got really interesting. And then he looked at me and he said, so what does Nirodha mean? And I said, it means surrender. And he said, oh. He said, how do you know that? And I said, because I've meditated a lot. And he said, but do you understand the Sanskrit? And I said, no, I don't, but I'm be very happy if you explained it to me. And he said, okay, Rodha means to refrain, which is not the same as to restrain. And ni doesn't mean what nir means, where nir in nirvana or nirvikalpa or nirbija means to negate or to oppose. Ni means deep within. So I kind of calculated, the implications of what he said, and I just smiled, and he just smiled. He said, yeah, he said, just carry on translating it, you'll be fine. So that was for me like the necessary encouragement from somebody who knew a lot more about Sanskrit than I did to follow my own experience in doing it.
Yeah, I think that's one of the reasons why I have gravitated toward Desikachar teachings, because I've heard him talk about them as like the sutras as like mnemonic devices, that they're all about people inquiring and into their own experience.
Yeah.
It's interesting to me, the idea of Nirodha being relinquishing. The one that I've most gravitated to was the idea of directing your attention, because trying to stop my mind or cease the vrittis always felt like a very futile effort. But I can direct my attention at things, which is what I've always thought that sutra was referring to. But you are suggesting that it has to do with a deep inward relinquishing.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, let me just sort of be devil's advocate to you, Jay, right now.
Sure.
You say you found it difficult to stop your mind, but
Yeah.
you found it possible to direct your mind. So I say yes, but for how long before it just started again doing something else? So I think that's the reality. You can't control your mind in the sense that you can't have a project say, right, for now I'm not going to think about leaves for the next 2 hours. Whatever, it's not going to work. But what I experienced as a meditator under the supervision of Zen masters was that whenever I set about to do something to stop my mind, I actually learned a number of ways to stop my mind, but they all took a huge amount of effort. They were all exhausting. And none of them felt satisfying. But I was kept being asked the same question by my teacher. Well, it wasn't really a question. I was being told by my teachers, literally, do nothing. So I was interpreting this as meaning, make the mind do nothing, or stop the mind. And so I was coming up with all kinds of ways of let's say what I would now say manufacturing moments of silence in my mind, but they required a huge amount of effort. And then one day I just got to the fucking point when I was just sick of these guys saying, no, that's not it, and kind of like psychologically slapping me, when I would go to them with great pride, like, okay, I've learned how to stop a thought forming, for example. I learned how I could feel almost like a sensation that indicated, okay, a thought is coming, and I learned how to stop it. And I was rejected. Everything was rejected. And then I just got to that point when I was sitting on my cushion and I was so fucked off with my failure that I just let go. I completely let go of my intention to do nothing. And then nothing happened.
Well, I guess what I was referring to, and it seems like it's in what you just said too, that the idea of directing attention is that you develop sustained attention. Like if your mind is all over the place, you can't just be sitting with how things are as they are. Like that there's a process that someone might need to go through, and that's maybe what practice is about, of developing sustained attention so you can distinguish between the many voices in your head and find the truer voices or whatnot.
Yeah, I don't see it like that at all, even if it sounded a little bit like that, because I was on that path, and I definitely was. I was trying to develop control over my mind, to stop thoughts from forming, to let go of a thought before it produced a second thought. And all of those games you can say that I've played, I became able to play them, but they didn't have any significance whatsoever. They didn't provide me with any satisfaction. They didn't give me any insight really into anything. But when I had this experience of getting to the point where I felt so deeply that I was not going to be able to make it happen. In other words, I surrendered. It happened. So I would say that there is, and I think that this is the Zen game to a certain extent, get people, because people automatically believe that you have to do something to get something. So get people to try everything. And when they've tried everything and everything has failed, then maybe they'll let go and just be. Now, I'm not saying that all of that stuff beforehand doesn't contribute to what happens when you let go. I'm sure that it does up to a point. But for me, the fundamental takeaway from that whole process for me is that effort and intention have no spiritual value. They are always going to get in the way spiritually. They may have psychological value. We know they can have physical value, economic value, social value, but spiritual value, no. So this is what relinquishment means to me. So, but how do you get to a point where you can really, really let go? And I think the answer is very simple. You have to feel totally, totally safe. And that's all.
I was going to ask this question where you went, and yes, you have to feel safe. But what I was thinking is like, well, what are the things that what is it? I've had these moments of surrender. I've been talking about them a lot. And for me, that there's something that you're surrendering to, and that seems to require like a certain faith that it's going to be okay if you give up on it or whatever.
Well, I mean, it's not like that for me. It's a surrendering of, for me. But of course, that turns into a surrendering into something. But it's not like, oh, I know there's something there. I want to find it, or I want to access it. For me, it's, and I think also in terms of how Patanjali, or how I understand what Patanjali is saying about the nature of perception and the opposition between the seer and the seen, and the self and the other, the subject and the object, and how they dissolve. That for me is gives me a context for being able to speak about what am I surrendering out of, and what am I surrendering into. And what I'm surrendering out of is my insistence on my own separateness. What I'm surrendering into is, to use Patanjali's word again, kaivalya. And kaivalya to me means otherlessness, that there is no other. And for me, if you, that, let's say, sense or experience that there is no other, which doesn't just to me mean there is no other human being. It means there is no other being of any kind. There is no other. That, and I think maybe really that alone is the only thing that can make you feel completely safe, because
I don't know. That doesn't make me feel safe when you say there's nothing other. Like, let me ask you a question. But I didn't
say nothing other. I said no other.
Okay, I get. Here's the thing. I'm a little hung up because I get the interconnectedness and the feeling of being okay because of that. I think I understand what you're saying. But what I'm getting hung up on is like when you said, "I surrender," and it just happens. When I hear that, it feels like there's an implication of some kind of intelligence at work.
Oh, yeah. Well, I would say yes, because that's what's happening. Intelligence is expressing itself as the universe. And it's
intelligence as itself. So you just think of it as a force or morphic resonance of intelligence. You don't strike me as a materialist. I don't know if that's a word that you would ever use, but like you seem to embrace that there is something beyond what science alone can observe. And yet I don't hear you suggesting that there's any kind of like higher power or intelligent being. You're really thinking of it as just a force, maybe.
Well, I mean, I am reluctant to be anthropomorphic and to project onto the intelligent force that we're speaking about something that resembles humanness, being human, which has this very powerful element of individuality, because everybody is unique and everybody's DNA is unique. So we have that. That is our fundamental experience of being an intelligent being or being a conscious being. I don't want to project that onto the universe, because I think that that's a little bit small-minded to assume that to put it, but don't need to offend anybody, but to assume that we are made in the image of God is, I think, a big assumption. But that intelligence is...
that we're not is also an equal assumption, though.
Yeah, that we're not. Either way, So, but it would still, to me, suggest something. I would say, like, almost childish to want to conceive of the whole universe as something like us.
No, wait. I don't think that's what the assumption is. I mean, okay. I think it's a very pragmatic place, not at all immature or stupid, to think that if something's created, that there's a creator. Like, we can observe that, and the idea that we're created in God's image actually goes to your definition of Ishvara, which I thought was quite interesting, which has to do with to choose, I believe you wrote.
Yeah.
So the idea that Ishvara, which some people think of as a supreme being, and one of the gifts, the gift that God gave, if you look at it from a Christian perspective, is he gave us the right to choose. As a creator, he gave us, that's what it means to be in the image of God, is that you have been given the right to not even have to believe that he exists.
Yes, well, I would say, if you want to use that terminology, I would say we are an encapsulation of God. If God refers to what is, or let's call it the intelligent power of the universe. And I would, when I say the intelligent power of the universe, I don't mean that there is something that has that intelligent power. I mean that intelligent power is the universe, that it is an intelligent power in a way that it maybe is a little difficult for us with our cultural assumption that intelligence is something that we have. But actually, for me, intelligence is not fundamentally something that we have. Intelligence is something that we most fundamentally are, and it expresses itself in different ways. Like our ability to think is only one expression of the intelligence that we are, but our ability to catch a ball that's thrown at us is also an expression of the intelligence that we are, and the ability of our cells to keep themselves alive is an expression of the intelligence that we are. So in that sense, there is a surrendering into that intelligence, out of the sense that I'm all alone, I'm vulnerable, I'm only here for a short time, I don't know enough to know what to do. I surrender out of that and into this intelligence, which is in no way separate from me, but I don't represent the totality of it either.
Yeah, I think you, at the beginning of your annotated sutras, you use like capital consciousness, lowercase consciousness, capital self, lowercase self. And I guess the question I'm kind of pointing to, and you do write this, you refer to in your consideration of Ishvara Pranidhana, you refer to it as an impersonal consciousness. And I guess that's it. That is it impersonal or is it personal?
Well, I mean, it's impersonal in the sense that it's not Godfrey. I don't have any problem with the kind of Hindu concept of, let's say, Krishna is the supreme personality of the Godhead. I have no, that's great, but it's not, that's got nothing to do with my personal experience. I wouldn't bother to argue with that or for it, but say, yeah, I can go with that. But for me, the issue is more to do with the fact that contemporary philosophers and scientists, in their explanation of consciousness, in my opinion, are only looking in a puddle. They're just looking in the puddle. And that puddle is the domain of human experience. But the ocean of consciousness is much, much bigger than that. And I think that Sanskrit gives us the simple terminology for recognizing that when they have the word chitta, which is the word that's almost every time chitta or chittasya comes in the Yoga Sutras, it's in that what I would call derived form until the very, very end when when it's chitti shakta.
Mm.
So most people who are interested in yoga will have heard of the proposition Sat Chit Ananda, which many gurus take to be part of their name.
Mm.
And that central word, Sat Chit Ananda, chit is not chitta, but it's what chitta is derived from. So that's consciousness with a big C, or impersonal consciousness. And chitta, for me, is personal consciousness. So Godfrey has his consciousness, Jay has his consciousness, but actually they're both compressions of chit, of impersonal consciousness. And for me, what's functioning within your nervous system, and therefore within your experience, and what's functioning through mine is the same thing.
Mm.
But because it's functioning through different wiring, it has a different way of experiencing itself.
Mm-hmm. I think I understand what you're saying. Is the impersonal consciousness that you're referring to like benign? Does it love us? Is it love? Like some people talk about it as love. And when when Zen people talk about it, it feels very cold and like nothing. And sometimes it feels very devotional and bhakti, like a loving father or mother. When it's impersonal, that's why I feel like you said before, like in order to have the fortitude and faith to surrender in the way that you're describing, I personally need to have felt held in a way where I would be safe. And the idea of just this impersonal intelligence didn't make me feel that way, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, for me, to speak to my experience.
Yes, I'm speaking to mine, so please always speak to yours.
Yeah. So rather than any concept that I might really have derived from my experience of, let's say, settling into or letting go into the presence of impersonal consciousness is very warm. It's very rich. There's a lot of love there, but it's unconditional love without an object.
Mm.
And it's imperturbable peace without a cause. And it's inexhaustible joy without a reason. So it's not the kind of relativistic, dualistic opposite to.
Mm.
So for me to go into the relativistic, dualistic sphere of human experience, I would say that love and hate are not opposite.
Mm.
The love contains everything, including hate. And it's the people that you love that you end up hating.
Mm.
So to me, there is actually no intrinsic duality between opposites. That so-called hatred is a part of love. Everything to me is a part of love.
All right. So are you suggesting that there is no right or wrong?
Oh, from the human point of view, there absolutely is right and wrong. And that right and wrong is based on the fact that we're vulnerable biological beings. And it is very, very unpleasant for us to even witness.
If you are hearing this message, then you're listening to the free version of Jay Brown Yoga Talks. To hear the rest of our conversation, please subscribe to Podcast Premium at jbrownyoga.com/premium.